I believe it's important for a game to have a setting with its own identity. To achieve this, I invented a few words and corresponding symbols which were put onto the tablets. I also created a few details about the civilization, naming it the Donactus Empire, and about how the living statues called Orilla were created. I decided they would be created using blood magic, to add to the sense of evil the player gets from the Donactus Empire. Though this is not actually depicted in game, I was also responsible for the game's sound design. I used sound effects to create a sense of physicality. Walking, dashing, jumping, and so on, everything has a corresponding sound. I composed 4 pieces of music, one for the menu and one for each of the levels. The music could only change when the current piece ends, as cutting off a piece of music in the middle undermines its structural integrity. This can lead to musical lag, but the pieces are short enough this isn't too important.
My main role was designing, modeling, and animating all of the characters throughout the game. Early on, the team agreed that the NPCs of the game, called the Orilla, would be animated statues given life and being forced to work. I came up with several designs using different materials. I feel like the clay does a good job showing off the really harsh conditions the characters are living in, and you can see the scrapes and cracks all over. Making the guard designs was fairly simple, as they take a lot of inspiration from medieval armor. I did give them one ominous glowing eye to make the design much more interesting, but also to make them much more threatening. I was hoping that this would convey that these were characters that you needed to avoid. Overall, I'm very happy with how these characters turned out.
The goal for level 1 was to create an environment which felt like servants' quarters, but also to make it feel like it was a part of something grander, but at the poorest level. I was responsible for the level design, as well as creating and assembling the modular assets and props. Many of the simpler props were used to bring life to the level, however the doors, crates, and barrels were not only to act as props, but also as obstacles for the player. Level 2 was more of a collaboration between me and Jacob. He built the initial version of the level, however I expanded upon his ideas to create a level where the player has much more freedom of choice, and also to make it feel more grand as a palace. I produced the window assets, enlarged the level, and also added the throne room to make sure it contrasts much more heavily to the claustrophobic level 1. I also did the lighting and produced a majority of the visual effects in the game to immerse the player more into the environment.
For level 2, I really wanted the player to feel like they were in this elaborate palace, full of guards and things only the rich can really afford to do. So I chose to use a lot of marble and polished wood materials and give the whole place very high ceilings. To make it look more possible, I created a pillar that you see in the main hallway and then the throne room to help support the ceilings. I also created the bells in the Simon Says puzzle at the very end, basing it off the old game of the same name. After that, I wanted the player to get some experience with the outdoors. So I created a large, well-kept garden for the player to explore and solve the final puzzle that you see in the middle. This puzzle uses both the symbols you see on the tablets throughout the game, as well as an order displayed on the fountain in the center. After solving the puzzle, the player will finally be able to escape.
My main role early on was writing the code that drives the player character. This involved setting up basic first-person movement, as well as 3 unlockable abilities: a jump, a dash, and a crouch. A lot of work went into adjusting the player character's walk speed and jump height, as well as the distance covered by their dash. It was important that moving through the different levels felt fun. I also wrote code to track the player character's collisions with different objects, and allow them to interact with the various objects and NPCs in the game. Later on, I added some camera effects, including a field of view change while the player character is dashing, and a toggleable head bob effect. Toward the end, I also pitched in to help with the UI programming, as well as writing a script that would make platforms swing back and forth in order to make the game world feel less static.
I had the task of programming the puzzles which the player must complete. First were the tablets. I used one script to break the tablets, and another to keep track of which ones had been broken. I used the code Hunter wrote to handle interacting with these, as well as the other 2 puzzles. Second, I had to program Simon Says. I used a single script for this, which is attached to the button that's used to show you the order you're supposed to ring them in. It starts by generating an array of 4 numbers, which are either 1, 2, or 3. When you press the button, it uses the array to ring the bells in the right order. When you ring a bell, it checks against the array to see if you ring the right one. Last was what we call the fountain puzzle. I used 3 different scripts, one for the buttons, one for the pillars, and one for the fountain. This was the simplest and fastest way to do this, while also being effective. I also did most of the programming for the UI, but there's not as much to talk about there, except that I used player preferences to store mouse sensitivity, music volume, and sound effect volume.
I did AI programming and animation implementation with state machines. I believe that player feedback is important while playing a game, so I wanted to make the NPCs as interactable and realistic in their patterns as possible. You can interact with maids and they will tell you stories about the world and make the environment feel alive. Maids will switch between default idle states such as sleeping or standing, and move to a talk animation when you interact with them. Guards have a set patrol route, and when you come into their range they will say a line of dialogue and try and catch you.